Weinzinger is the Karner Blue Butterfly Recovery Coordinator for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And she's been doing that since she completed her master's degree at UW Green Bay in 2016. For her thesis, she studied the northern blue butterfly, which is another small blue butterfly, but not the Karner blue. She lives in Grand Rapids, where she lives with her husband and her 2 dogs. And that's, you have the floor, Chelsea.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Oh, I have to do this first. Oh, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, that's me. Sorry.
That's okay.
One moment. Let me get back to you.
Can't take him anywhere.
Thought we had the see, we've met the enemy and he is us. You're all
Did the run
set.
through and everything.
Yeah, I know. So it's me. Okay, you're good. Give it a go.
Okay. All right. All right. Can everybody see my PowerPoint there?
Looks
Yes.
good.
Awesome. Okay. So thank you guys so much for having me. This is great. Normally, you know, I haven't really done anything outside of Wisconsin, so this is cool to be speaking to a little bit different crowd. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the DNR, Wisconsin DNR's conservation and monitoring for the Karner blue butterfly. So just a little bit about me. As Rena said, my name is Chelsea Weinzinger, and I got both my bachelor's and my master's from UW Green Bay, and I was lucky enough to get this Karner Recovery Coordinator position right out of grad school in 2016, and I've held that since. I always like to take a minute to talk about why it's important to care about butterflies. So they are really important ecological indicators. They can react quickly to environmental changes. They're very sensitive to any types of changes, and can give us sort of an early warning if the habitat is starting to degrade in certain areas. They're also really good indicators of biodiversity. And Karners have sort of become this flagship species for barrens and other species associated with barrens. So typically you're doing something that's going to benefit Karners. There's a whole host of other species that it will benefit as well. But we're here to talk about the Karner blue today. So just a little bit of information before we get started. So in 1992, it was listed as, it was federally endangered, and they're about the size of a postage stamp or thumbnail. So it's really easy to think that when you're looking at all these zoomed in photos, you're looking at something that's the size of maybe a monarch, but it's actually a quite small butterfly. So when we take a minute to look at the national range of Karners, you can see here that we'll kind of work our way from the outside in. So the dark purple coloring is the range of wild blue lupin, which is its only host plant. And the bright blue coloring is the historic range for the Karner blue butterfly. Then if you look a little bit closer, you can see there's some blue kind of dashed locations, and those are the current estimated ranges for the Karner blue. So you can see that Karners still remain in Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, New York, and New Hampshire. And unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, there was a population in Indiana, but we believe that that is extirpated right now. So I just wanted to touch base a little bit on each of these states. I by no means am any expert on any of these states, but this information comes from the Federal Recovery Group. So when we look at Michigan, they believe that their populations are increasing, both on state lands and the Huron-Manistee National Forest lands. They have been doing quite a bit of habitat restoration, and the Karners are benefiting and moving into those areas. And they also have high goals by the end of 2026 to add an additional 3,000 acres of savanna habitat, which is great. So as far as we know, Michigan populations are doing well. As I mentioned, Indiana, not so much. The last two Karners were seen in 2014, and they have done surveys since then with no luck of finding them. Despite that, they still conduct habitat management in the habitat that was previously occupied by Karners. In Ohio, there is one site where Karners occur. They were reintroduced, and the numbers are pretty low at that site. So they rear Karners at the Toledo Zoo, and they augment the population by using those reared Karners. In New York, again, most populations are stable at their sites. It's not as widespread as in Michigan or Wisconsin, but they're continuing to do habitat management and working on improving the populations that they do have. In New Hampshire, it sounds like the population was on the decline in that state. They still are working on their habitat management, and it sounds like they also do some augmentation of captive reared butterflies as well to this population. Excuse me, and then in Wisconsin, this state supports the largest and most widespread number of Karner populations. Many populations declined in 2012 after we had a pretty severe drought here, and they appear to be rebounding since then, which is great. We've also made a lot of improvements with our monitoring program, as well as continuing habitat restoration each year. So in Wisconsin, we have what's called a high potential range map. So this is a model output that estimates where you're most likely to find Karner habitat. This is used a lot with our habitat conservation plan, which is more of the regulatory side of things, which I'll talk about in a little bit here. But this gives you a good idea of where estimated Karner range is. And so if you look here, the closest areas for you guys are probably going to be maybe Marquette or Green Lake County. And I think Karner Blue Meadow might be in Waushara County, which would make sense. So that section, you can use this map to kind of get an idea as well. Typical habitat that Karners prefer are your more open sandy areas, so savanna and barrens, as well as some prairies. They can also be found in right-of-way corridors wherever their host plant grows, which prefers sandy soils. Again, wild lupin is the Karner's only known host plant. It's from the pea family and grows best in sandy soils and typically blooms from May to June. This plant is relatively easy to identify. It's got a unique leaf shape, 7 to 11 leaflets, and typically grows in clumps. And it's got beautiful tall purple flowers. So it can range from kind of a purplish bluish color to white, and then kind of any shade in between. If you're seeing lupins that are pink or red or yellow, those are not the native species of lupin, and we definitely don't want those growing in Karner habitat. So we always talk about making sure that you're getting your native lupin and putting it in on your property. So to dive in a little bit about the Karner life cycle, Karners have 2 flight periods, which means that the adults fly in two cycles throughout the summer. So over the winter, Karners spend it as an egg. And then in the springtime, the larva hatches. feeds on lupin, and then pupates, and in late May to early June, the first flight adults hatch. Then those adults only live for about 7 to 10 days. So it's not a very long-lived adult butterfly. And then, so while those adults are alive, they will mate, and then, I don't know why that keeps happening, sorry about that. And then they will lay their eggs, and then those eggs will go through that same process. And the second flight adults will then emerge in early to mid-July. Really depends on weather conditions. Then those second flight adults, same thing, they mate and then lay their eggs, and then the eggs that they lay in, mid-July through August are the ones that have to spend their time overwintering and hopefully survive until the next year. So if you can see here, you've got the egg on the left here, and it's about the size of a pinhead. So it's a very small, females typically lay eggs on the stem of the lupin plant or just underneath the leaf. And the egg has a little bit of a dimple kind of in the middle. So you can actually see these just with your naked eye but you have to look pretty hard. So then once they hatch, you can see the middle photo is a picture of a larva. So you can see the ants crawling all over it. And it's really hard to see the caterpillar on the leaf because it blends in so well, but you can see it's got kind of a darker green line going down the middle of it. And so the ants and the larva actually have this cool mutualism where the larva secretes this sugary substance, and the ants eat that and in turn protect the larva from parasites and predators. So it's an interesting mutualism there. Then you'll see the adult butterfly here. And again, the adults have 2 flight periods. The first one being that late May, early June timeframe, and then the second flight period being that early to mid-July. In order to identify a Karner blue, you have to look at the underside of the butterfly. And when you look at that underside, you'll see there's orange crescents on the forewing and the hindwing. And adjacent to those orange crescents are these little blue metallic dots. So the orange has to be on that top wing and that bottom wing. And again, if you see it from the top side, you can't identify it just from that. You have to see the underside. In order to identify whether it's a male or female, then you look at the top side. So after you've confirmed by the underside, oh, yep, that's a Karner, you can look at the top. And if it has just a bright blue, completely filled out blue area, that's a male. And then the females are a little bit more dull. So they do have some bluish hue to them, but more of a brownish overall color. And then the females also do have orange crescents on their hind wings on the top side as well, which you can see in the photo. In Wisconsin, we do have, other blue species and look-alike species. So it's important that we make sure we're looking at the underside. And I would say the one species that is most easily mixed up would be the eastern-tailed blue, which is here at the bottom left corner. They have orange crescents on their hind wing there. You can see it on the top side and on the underside, but they do not have orange crescents on their top wing there. So they also have tails, which as they get worn out, sometimes you won't be able to see the tails, but that's probably the butterfly that is most easily confused with the Karner. So to jump in a little bit about the specific DNR program for our Karner program here, there's sort of 2 branches. So there's the recovery program, which is what I'm in, and I spend a lot of time monitoring populations, and we work towards the population goals that U.S. Fish and Wildlife sets for us to work towards delisting and reclassifying Karners. Then the other branch is this habitat conservation plan. And this is more of the regulatory side of things. So the HCP holds an incidental take permit, which if you become a partner within this group, then you are covered by this incidental take permit, which allows activities to occur in a way that minimize impact to Karners. So for example, you know, if Department of Transportation needs to mow alongside highway and that's in Karner habitat, they have specific protocols that they can follow so that they're minimizing their impact to Karners, but while also getting their work done. And if some take does happen of Karners, they're covered. So back to the recovery program, like I said, we do a lot of monitoring of populations, and we use 2 different survey methodologies to do that, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We also spend a lot of time working on habitat improvement and monitoring the status of habitats. And then we're also doing a lot of coordinating in terms of grant applications or on the ground work. So maybe we're coordinating a volunteer day or even things like this where we're doing public outreach and just educating people about Karner. So looking at the monitoring, we do 2 different survey methods. So the first survey method is our occupancy surveys, which are just sort of basic presence absence, but we do ask for our volunteers to count the number of Karners they see in a certain amount of time. And this is done with our volunteer program. So I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but with our volunteers, we've started it just a few years ago, and we've had quite a bit of interest and increase in the program in the last few years, which is great. And then the distance sampling method is a much more intensive survey method, and it looks at conducting surveys in a way to calculate abundance. And so we usually hire a crew to conduct those surveys for us. So this map just shows the difference between the number of surveys conducted. So the blue dots represent our occupancy surveys, and the purple dots represent our distance surveys. So those purple dots, there are a lot fewer because that is a much more intensive and expensive survey method. The one we've got, you know, the volunteers conducting our occupancy surveys, we're getting a lot more information. So with these occupancy surveys, like I mentioned, we started our volunteer monitoring program in 2018. And looking at last year, 2020, because we haven't collected data this year yet. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do our typical trainings due to COVID, but we were able to work with other contract crews to get more surveys done using that methodology. And we had 133 data submissions, which was really similar to 2019, which I was really happy with considering we had COVID last year to deal with, so I'll take it. And then in 2020, we surveyed 76 sites as compared to 59 sites in 2019. So more area, more sites were being covered. Then we found that 30% more Karners were seen in 2020 than in 2019. And you can see that each year, the number of individuals that we were finding was increasing, which is great. You know, you're covering more area, you're looking for more butterflies, so you would hope that you find more, and it's good that we did. And then looking at our 2021 field season, we've tried to transition all of our trainings to online. So we've got almost everything available on there, and there is a volunteer monitoring website. So if you guys are interested, I can send Rena the link for that after this, you know, if you want to check that out. But we do have all that information online as well. So looking at these occupancy surveys, we do have some results, just preliminary, that we can check out. So these data may be a little bit higher just because these sites aren't truly random. We might have a volunteer want to go to a site that, maybe there was an observation there 5 years. So we're not actually taking a random section from the state and getting these results. So the numbers might be a little bit high, but it's a really good place for us to start. So if we look at the detection rate, which is the chance of actually detecting a Karner if it's there, the percentage is 0.93, which is awesome. That means that there's a really high probability that if a Karner is at a site, a volunteer will be able to detect it. Looking at the occupancy rate, which means the number of sites that are currently occupied, we get a different number for that every year. So you can see in the table, in 2018, we had a little bit lower occupancy rate, but then each year we surveyed more area and our occupancy rate increased a little bit, which again was great. 2019 and 2020 had approximately the same, which again, that's good. It's a nice high occupancy rate of 0.82. So a lot of the sites had Karners when we were there. Now we look at the colonization and extinction rate. So colonization rate means the number of sites, or the proportion of sites that had no Karners and then Karners occupied them, which was 0.27. And then the extinction rate, which is the sites that had Karners and then lost them, which was 0.04. So we always want to make sure our colonization rate is higher than our extinction rate. And in this case, it was. So that's really good information for us to know as well. And through all of these surveys with volunteers, we found 18 new populations within 5 counties in the state. And one of them being in Columbia County, which is much further south than anyone anticipated. So that is probably not a sustainable population, but it was still cool to find a Karner population further south than expected. So then looking at our more intensive distance sampling sites, we've got about 18 that we're sampling now. We didn't have as many previously, but we've been able to build up our sites. And we surveyed just under 600 acres through that sampling method. And looking at that information, if we compare 2020 to 2019, we saw 7 sites decrease, 9 increase, and then 2 of them were new, so they didn't have comparable data. But what we saw was a 30% overall increase in abundance from 2019 to 2020, which was great. And 2020 was the 4th highest year out of the last 13 years. Now with the abundance data, it gives us a table that looks like this. And these are the estimated number of butterfly individuals at each of these properties per year. This doesn't take into account the amount of area surveyed per year. You can see that some of the sites are missing surveys, right? So there's little dash lines where we weren't able to conduct surveys. So we want to take that into account and standardize our data. So instead of looking at the abundance, where if we look at the average population size and compare that to 2020 without standardizing our data, it says that 2020 was 19% above average. But if after we standardize it and we just use, sites per acre, then we see that 2020 was actually 2% below average. So we're taking this into account and making sure that we're clearly showing what's valuable in that regard. So if you look at this figure here, you can see this is the overall population estimate of butterflies per acre, and we're on an increasing trend, which is good. And 2016, you can see, was just a record year for Karners here in Wisconsin. And I was hired in 2016, so there's a running joke that I brought them all out. I like to think that anyway. So how do we improve the Karner populations? What do we try to consider when we're wanting to help specifically. Well, we can't control the weather, unfortunately, which is a huge factor with Karners. So next we look at habitat, and Karners are in a habitat that is in an early successional stage. So once the shrubs and tree cover start to shade out these areas, populations can start to wink out. So it's important that we're keeping a lot of these areas managed, right? So we're keeping the shrub cover down, the tree cover down. That's not to say that tree cover isn't important, because we want to make sure we have heterogeneity in these habitats. So if it's a drought year, we want to make sure we have some shaded areas with lupin, so that not all the lupin fries up, throughout the summer, and then Karners have nothing left to eat. So we're continuing to manage in a very specific way. And the way we do that is through lots of different types of management. So we do conduct burning, mowing, herbicide application, lots of different things like that. And actually you can see here in this slide, the two pictures on the bottom. The one on the left is the before with all that scrub oak down in there. And then the picture on the right is the more after it was mowed down. It's now more of an open, more conducive area to Karners. And wild lupin actually really benefits from soil disturbance. So in an area where you might have a tractor or a mower that is tearing up some of the soil, lupin actually prefers that and will come up after that. So it's all beneficial. When it comes to habitat improvement planning, so like within the DNR, we don't have like one big game plan that says, okay, this is specifically how we're doing things for Karners. What we have are these protocols set forth using that HCP regulatory program. And so our DNR property managers utilize all the protocols that the HCP provides when they're, going forward to manage their properties. So for example, when property managers want to conduct burning, on their property, what they do is they follow these specific guidelines in order to minimize impact for Karners and ultimately benefit them as well. And that's how we do it throughout the whole state, within the Karner range. If we're wanting to target a specific area, typically we're writing grants for that stuff, and that's coming from me in the recovery program. So, right now we do have a grant where we've got about 800 acres of habitat improvement happening, and we're hoping that it'll end up being closer to 1,000 acres once we're finished. So then I always kind of like to wrap up with how you can help. And if you guys were in Wisconsin, I would encourage you to join the volunteer monitoring program. But maybe if you have family or friends in Wisconsin, you can always encourage them to check it out or see if they'd be interested in joining. And one thing that everybody can do is plant native forbs, lots of nectaring species, which are good for butterflies as well as other pollinators. Just making sure that you're working with maybe a native nursery that's close to you, so you can get that specific species for your area. So that's everything I have for my overall presentation. So if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them for you.
Yeah, I have some questions in the chat, Chelsea. Thank you very much.
Yep, great.
Okay, let's see. All right, Maureen says there are groups of wild lupine plants growing at Illinois Beach State Park, North Unit. That is in Zion, which is close to Wisconsin, on the way to Wisconsin. Has there ever been a population at that site?
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
No, not that I know of.
Okay. And then Bob Stanley asks, Do you have to capture the butterflies to assure correct identification? And how do your volunteers avoid injuring them in the process if that's the case?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we actually encourage our volunteers to take photographs. So I don't think you can touch Karners technically federally, but we definitely encourage them to take photos in the volunteer program. So we use iNaturalist for the data submission, and so Karners typically land pretty quickly. They don't, unless it's really hot out, they don't spend a ton of time just flying away. So they're usually kind of, mess around, and then they'll sit down for a little bit, and then they'll fly a little bit again, and then they'll sit down. So they're a relatively easy butterfly to photograph. And like, I'm not sure who said it earlier, but they'll land on you too, and, suck up the sweat on you and stuff. So they're not terribly difficult to photograph. That's our go-to for that.
So just to kind of round out that, so you're saying that that's why all a volunteer needs is a smartphone just to photograph.
Yeah, yep.
Okay. But then they still have to count.
Right. So what we say is we only require one photograph for the data submission. So they don't have to photograph every single butterfly individual that they see. We just want them to photograph one, so then they know what the Karners look like. And then they can go ahead and do the rest of their counts and tally, the number of Karners that they see.
Okay. Do Karners migrate, or do they mostly stay in a restricted locale? If the latter, is this a problem when sites have controlled burns?
Yep, so they don't migrate, and they usually stay relatively close to where they were hatched. So when we do burns, we require that there is another known population nearby that you can save as refugia. So we say that there has to be another known Karner population within 300 meters of your burning area, so that population can then recolonize the burn area. So that was one of those HCP protocols that I mentioned, where we have to burn in a specific way to make sure that we're mitigating for any effects, that might happen from that burn.
Got it. Okay, and Sandra's question is, how many Karners do you need for a sustainable population?
That's a good question. Within the recovery, there's a recovery plan, federal recovery plan, that states there are small viable populations, which are 3,000 individuals, and then large viable populations, which is 6,000. So those are their goals they set forth for putting the listing towards reclassification. But in terms for a population to persist in a small area, I'm not sure how many you would have to say for that. I mean, I've seen populations that are in maybe 5 acres, and there was probably thousands of butterflies in that 5 acres. And I've seen some where there's maybe, dozens spread out among 5 acres. So it's really hard to give a gauge on that.
Okay. Carla, I think, here's Carla's question, but I think you might have answered this. Carla said, I got to get back to it. The Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network volunteers went to see the Karners in Indiana some years ago on a field trip. She asked if they're being monitored there, but I think you said they were believed to be extirpated since 2014.
Yeah, so the last Karners seen there were 2014, and I know that it was documented that they did surveys 2015 through 2017. And that was the information I got for the other states was listed in the 5-year species assessment in the Fish and Wildlife Service link. So they did that in 2019. So there may be documented surveys that have happened since then. I just don't know about that.
Does anyone know where that was in Indiana? Carla, you might know. Was that Indiana Dunes, or?
I think it was Indiana Dunes.
Yeah, I remembered reading that. Okay, Marilyn asks, if we plant wild lupine in our yard, they probably won't come here, correct? It needs to be near an existing population already.
Probably, but I mean, we don't know where every single population of Karners is.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's unlikely, because you guys are so far south. But I will never say never. So.
So when you mentioned that before, being too far south, is that because it's not a good place for lupines to grow?
Not necessarily. The lupin range on that map shows that it does extend down into Illinois. So lupin should grow in your area. Why there's no Karners there is hard to say. There's a lot of variables that go in when it comes to, especially invertebrates. So, it's hard to say if it's just one thing. It's probably a number of things. But a lot of times when you're seeing reduction in population, it starts at that southern edge, and that's likely a climate change thing where these southern ranges are getting really warm for the species, so you're seeing them just move further and further
Too
north.
warm. Okay.
Yeah.
Bob has another question. What are the major predators of Karners?
Ooh, definitely other dragonflies. I actually saw there was I don't know what kind of insect it was, but it was another larger insect that mid-flight just took a Karner right out of the air. So, larger insects like that, and I'm sure birds too. But other than that, I mean, watching out for us not stepping on them, I guess.
Okay, human predators.
Yeah.
John asked, can you suggest a couple of places in Wisconsin that we in the Chicago area could visit with a good chances of finding Karners? I think you did mention a couple, but maybe you can be more specific. Or
yeah, so I just recommended the counties that would probably be closest to you, but I can definitely send you some specific locations, properties that you guys, if you're looking for a field trip where you would see Karners, I could definitely send those your way.
Yeah, why don't you? And then if anybody wants to know, other than John, which I know he does, please, email me or call me, and then I'll put you on the list and I'll send it back to everybody. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Chelsea. It's very interesting. And I just happened to come across this, I don't know why, a story about Karners in Wisconsin. I'm like, really? So who knew?
Yeah, no, I'm so glad. And we actually, it could have been on our outreach for volunteers, because we just did a lot of information out into the public and media, reaching out for volunteers. So that's cool. You guys picked this up. And if you have any questions or, anything after this, definitely feel free to email me. But I will email you tomorrow those properties that if you guys are looking to get out in the field, you can.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Sunny, are you going to unmute everybody?
I asked people if they wanted to be unmuted. They're certainly welcome to.
Yeah. Everybody's putting in the chat. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So very interesting. And what a great program for you, Chelsea. I'm sure.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate being able to chat with you.
Your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Say goodbye to everybody.
Bye.
Pretty interesting.
For those of you who are signing off, thank you very much for joining. Good to see you.
Yeah, but look for those butterflies.
Does anybody have a hunch where you could combine some bird watching and some butterfly watching? Do you know of a prairie bird that hangs out in these lupin areas by any chance?
I don't, obviously since it's midsummer, that's going to be pretty hard unless it's a grassland, and they aren't in grassland. So let's see we can reverse engineer that. Let's see where she says we should go, Then we can check eBird.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.